Last week we had major spike weeks from guys like Rachaad White, Baker Mayfield, David Njoku at the tight end position, and Rashad Bateman at the wide receiver position. Now last week when I did this video, I was off last week. It was not my best week, but we're coming in really hot with 6 guys that are going to go nuclear this week in fantasy. All I ask is that you go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So our first guy that we're getting into here, I feel very comfortable doing this, Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. I'm totally all in on him this week. First of all, for better or worse, don't sit Jayden Reed ever. This is not a guy who ever goes on my bench, and especially last week, it cost me in some certain leagues. He had a bad week last week, obviously. Jayden Reed had 2 catches for 10 yards on 4 total targets. This was absolutely not his best week. But here's my thing with Jayden Reed in particular. This is not just your average wide receiver like a CeeDee Lamb who runs a bunch of routes and gets a bunch of targets, or an Amon-Ra St. Brown or a Jamar Chase. That's not how he provides you wide receiver 1 upside here. This is a player who I have consistently compared to Deebo Samuel. I believe we're looking at Deebo Samuel Jr. right here, because not only does he not get 10 targets a game, he usually averages around 6 or 8 targets per game. And this guy also has a couple carries per game, which always fluctuate his level of upside, depending on if he hits a big run and gets in the end zone that way or not. It just hasn't happened the last several weeks with him. The floor is obviously very low with somebody like a Deebo Samuel, and it is exactly the same thing with Jayden Reed, but the ceiling is really freaking high. Now last week again, he struggled versus a tough Houston defense, but he's playing Jacksonville's defense this week. This is the cure for any kind of bad week that you're coming off as a wide receiver here. They are 31st versus wide receivers in fantasy football. They are absolutely bleeding points to wide receivers and quarterbacks. And I just see a big spike week coming with Jayden Reed. I feel really good about this one. Now going down to our running back here, our first running back, people just need to acknowledge that Kareem Hunt is an absolute must-start player right now. We need to just remember what he has done since he's become a Kansas City Chief. So let's look at what he's done since then. Since the first time that he put on a Kansas City Chiefs uniform and actually played real football for the Kansas City Chiefs in a full PPR format, here's what he's done. 10.5 fantasy points, 18.7 fantasy points, and 22.3 fantasy points, and that's in a full PPR format here. Now in that first game when he had 10.5 fantasy points, he only played 45% of the snaps. So that's a pretty good number to only play 45% of the snaps. But since that first game back, he's received at least 60% of the offensive snaps right here, and he's had 20 plus carries the last 2 games for Kansas City. The bottom line is, when you consider everything that's going on in Kansas City, obviously Pacheco's out. That's why Kareem Hunt is filling in the first place here. But Rashee Rice, he's gone. Juju Smith-Schuster, he's gone. Travis Kelce looks like his age. He looks like he should at his mid-30s here. They flat out just need Kareem Hunt. This is not a negotiable thing anymore. They need Kareem Hunt because Xavier Worthy's not coming through. They just traded for DeAndre Hopkins, and of course, we will see how that one plays out, but it's not likely going to be a DeAndre Hopkins week this week. Las Vegas is 27th versus the running back position in fantasy football. They're bleeding points to running backs, and the Raiders are a dumpster fire right now. They're a disgrace. They're a horrific team that any running back could take advantage of in fantasy football. This is not only just a must-start for this week, but I believe after this week, I won't have to put him in this video, because I think the bottom line is that everybody will realize after this game, you can't put Kareem Hunt on your bench. This is a guy who needs to find his way into your lineup one way or the other, especially in this week. Now, dropping down to our next running back here that I've already seen a ton of questions on this week. What should we do with J.K. Dobbins? J.K. Dobbins, I'm telling you right now, he's going right back into my lineup this week versus the New Orleans Saints in Los Angeles. So obviously, the question is that I'm getting is that, he's obviously coming off one of his worst weeks in fantasy football so far. It's no doubt that was one of his worst weeks. But let's just put it in perspective really quick with what J.K. Dobbins has done overall this year. So let's go to his 3 worst games in a full PPR format. His 3 worst games this year: 8.4 fantasy points, 9.2, and 9.6 fantasy points in a full PPR format. And the 9.6 is what he just got versus the Cardinals here. So realistically, putting that in perspective and comparing it to even somebody like a Saquon Barkley, that's actually a really good floor. That floor is pretty solid. Now, obviously, Saquon has the much higher ceiling than J.K. Dobbins does, But the ceiling games for J.K. Dobbins, they exceed 20 fantasy points in a full PPR format as well. And just the way New Orleans has looked defensively, they are 29th versus the running back position in fantasy football. They're even worse than the Raiders, which we just went over. And here's the deal. They've been ripped the last 2 weeks by running backs. Javonte Williams last week, and they got ripped by a combination of Bucky Irving and Sean Tucker just 2 weeks ago. Now, the reality is this is a very sustainable thing. Even though the Saints defense, I actually think is better than this, without Derek Carr, they can't sustain drives. So that defense is constantly on the field. And when you've got a run-first team like the Chargers clearly are, they're going to use J.K. Dobbins heavy in this game. J.K. Dobbins, again, should not find his way to your bench. He needs to get in your lineup one way or the other because he's about to go off this week. Dropping down to our next wide receiver here. Devonta Smith at the Cincinnati Bengals this week, I believe is a great must-start guy. Now, I called him a buy low trade target earlier this week. I put him out on Monday as a good buy low, and if you were able to buy him low for some of the suggestions that I said in that video, fantastic, you've got a good number 2 wide receiver. But also, this is a guy that is an immediate plug-and-play option right here. So obviously, let's just address last week because it was nasty. Last week, he had 2 targets, 1 reception for negative yardage. I mean, it was disgusting. It was totally disgusting. Now, from what I've seen, the ultimate fear with a guy like Devonta Smith is with A.J. Brown. Like the past 2 weeks, A.J. Brown has significantly cut Devonta Smith's target share. And let's acknowledge it. Obviously, that's true. 4 targets the week that A.J. Brown got back and 2 targets last week, as we just said, versus the New York Giants. That's what Devonta Smith has had come his way since A.J. Brown returned to the lineup. There's no arguing that here. It is a legit issue because I don't believe that Jalen Hurts is playing his best football right now. I just simply do not believe that is the case. Now, here's the deal why I think he's going to be a great play this week, and it's going to be different from last week. Cincinnati is 19th versus the wide receiver position in fantasy. Now, it's not obviously the worst, but it's obviously not very good either. But here's one of the biggest things for me this particular week for Devonta Smith. This is one of the highest over-unders of the week according to Vegas here. Vegas is expecting a lot of points in this one. I'm expecting a lot of points. And you know why? Because neither defense is particularly dominant here. And with the Cincinnati Bengals, they are also a pass-first team. And Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase, they're playing lights-out football right now. So if they can continue to just get tons of points, the Philadelphia Eagles are just going to simply have to match them in points. And the last shootout that the Philadelphia Eagles were in with A.J. Brown this year, this is what Devonta Smith did. It was versus Green Bay, that week 1 game in Brazil, if you remember. 15.4 full PPR fantasy points on 8 targets in that week. So it was a very good Devonta Smith week with A.J. Brown. This is a team that just needs a lot of points going on for both these wide receivers to be involved. And I think this is a big rebound week loading that we've got here with Devonta Smith. Now, going back to our quarterback start of the week, I love to stack quarterbacks and wide receivers. And that's exactly what I'm doing in this video by going with Jordan Love here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Obviously, this one isn't as bold as last week when I said Daniel Jones was a must-start guy and he was an absolutely utter disaster. I'm not going that deep this week. I'm going to go with somebody who I do think is, in my mind, a very obvious every week must-start player. But in reality, this is a guy who was drafted in like the 8th, 9th, 10th round, depending on what type of format you're playing in fantasy football. So not everyone views this guy as a must-start every single week. This week versus Jacksonville, it's obviously a very easy matchup, right? That's an easy one that I could point out to you guys, is that Jacksonville is dead last versus the quarterback position in fantasy football. And by the way, that's after they just played the New England Patriots. They're that bad at defending the pass. They are atrocious. They're a disgrace defending the pass. Here's the real deal, though. This is what is actually deeper and why I ultimately believe there's just no way that Jordan Love doesn't have a lethal game this week. Jordan Love himself has been excellent in fantasy football. You can see the numbers on the screen on a per-game basis for Jordan Love this year. His floor is really high. Like, he's not getting anywhere less than like 15, 16 fantasy points, unlike a guy like Patrick Mahomes has been giving you. But that's even with multiple interceptions in a game. He's throwing multiple interceptions per game at this point, and he's still providing you tons of fantasy upside. And the reason I think it's going to be so successful this week is because Jacksonville has 1 interception as a collective unit all year. All year, that's all they've gotten as a defense. They don't take the ball away from anybody. So what if we see Jordan Love come out here and put up 3 to 4 touchdowns, which I expect he will, and have no interceptions? This dude's in line for a 30-point game, in my opinion. He should not sniff your bench this week. He needs to be a must-start quarterback, regardless of who you've got options at. Now, our tight end start of the week. K. Dotton is obviously a pretty obvious one, right? K. Dotton, I think that he's going to be a really good play this week. He's taking on the Atlanta Falcons in Tampa Bay this week. Now, this one flat out just makes too much sense. Like, let's be completely honest here. It's not like this one has super deep analysis here. But the thing is that K. Dotton, a lot of people just picked him up off the waiver wire. And of course, in this tight end economy, we need all the points that we can get at the tight end position. So how can we be so sure and so certain that K. Dotton can go right into your lineup here? Well, here's the deal. Obviously, he's going to be a big beneficiary without Chris Godwin and Mike Evans this week. There's no question about that. That guy had 10 targets versus the Baltimore Ravens this past week. So he's obviously going to be really involved. Atlanta's 17th versus the tight end position, which again, isn't terrible, but isn't great either, obviously. But even before last week, when he had 10 targets versus the Baltimore Ravens, the previous 4 games before that Baltimore game, he's averaging just under 7 targets per game. Like, he's realistically already become more involved and very important to that passing offense that Tampa Bay has. Obviously, it completely changes the game when you have 2 of the best wide receivers in the NFL that are now out indefinitely. So K. Dotton flat out is just too necessary for this offense. He's going to hit big this week versus the Falcons. So let me know how your lineup is looking so far this week. And if you want to see the top 30 wide receiver rankings for this week, click on this video right here.